Graham Kelly, we go live to Hillsborough, to the Hillsborough pitch, and there in the red tracksuit tops are the Nottingham Forest players, looking totally shocked by the events, waiting to go home. Steve Hodge there facing the camera. The Nottingham Forest players who, with Liverpool, had just 6 minutes play before the crush occurred at the Leopards Lane end of Hillsborough. And I would reiterate at this moment that the local ambulance service in Sheffield report that some 50 people have lost their lives this afternoon. We have an emergency number for those of you who are concerned about the safety of your loved ones. A Sheffield number, 0742 570 800. Let me repeat that number for you. 0742 570 800. Well, we leave Hillsborough there, and we're going to go straight away now to the classified result.
He's not with me at the minute, Bob, but we will hear from him in just a second. I have to say, obviously, our thoughts now have turned completely to those who, sadly and tragically, have been bereaved in this dreadful tragedy here at Hillsborough. The police are just gathering their numb thoughts over there, and one can only think of those whose dear loved ones were lost in the Bradford fire. Only they perhaps could quite appreciate the feelings that will be on Merseyside tonight. We have, of course, heard from Graham Kelly, and now we can hear from a man who was close to the pitch while the dreadful mayhem was going on, the Liverpool manager, who was at the heart of several conversations with supporters who were trying to explain what happened, Kenny Dalglish.
Kenny, your thoughts tonight, first and foremost, will be with the Liverpool fans.
Can't be anything else, can they? Can't be anything to do with football, can they? That was the furthest thing in my football mind, really. And the thing that was more upsetting is the fact that it was there was no animosity, and it was just sheer numbers and volume of numbers that caused it. There's very little we can do. We can only sympathise with the people that have had fatalities, and obviously friends and relatives that have unfortunately been injured. There's no way that we can be held responsible for anything like that, really.
Second time around for you too. I mean, how do you react to it?
There's not much we can do, is there, really? Just say it's different circumstances. There's no comparison whatsoever, really, between the two. I mean, that was just sheer numbers of people wanting to get in to see the match. I'm sure there'll be people who will be accusing certain bodies of responsibility, but at the end of the day, I think that's irrelevant at the moment. I think it's the only thing we could do immediately after the game or after the incident was to try and help the people who were there and make sure that the numbers that were going to be involved, either being hurt or dying, were going to be minimal.
Presumably behind that goal there were friends of yours, friends of the players?
Yeah. I mean, obviously everybody's got friends. And I think that's the reason why I think afterwards you get a reaction, because obviously, I mean, it's a family club that we've got, and there must have been a lot of people there who knew each other. I mean, they might not have gone to the game with the person that was hurt or died, but I mean, they would have known them. And they got upset. And then their upset turns to anger, and maybe that's why it takes long to calm it down.
What's the feeling within Liverpool Football Club then tonight?
Well, I don't know. I don't know, really. I just say it's taken out of our hands, really. The organisation, and we went along the guidelines that people had given us, and we applied them. There's very little we can do.
It's another desperately sad season for you.
As I say, football's irrelevant when something like that happens. At this moment in time, the games are off finished, and nobody's even bothered to ask the scores. Nobody wants to know the scores because it's irrelevant.
Kenny, thanks very much.
Thank you.
So finally, on what started out as one of football's happiest days, turned to tragedy at Hillsborough in the Liverpool-Nottingham Forest Cup semi-final. 53 fans have known to have died, crushed to death as a section of the Liverpool end became overcrowded. At least 50 other people were badly injured as fans scrambled over fences to escape the crush. It is one of the worst ever disasters in football, the biggest death toll being at Ibrox in '71 when 66 people were killed. We do have an emergency number for those of you who are concerned about the safety of your loved ones. 0742 570 800.
The main story this evening, 74 football supporters are reported to have been crushed to death at the FA Cup final at Hillsborough in Sheffield this afternoon. Hundreds more were injured. Fans rushed through a broken turnstile, crushing Liverpool supporters against the front of the stand. The ambulance service and Sheffield's hospitals have been helping the untold number of injured. At least 74 football fans are feared to have been crushed to death at the FA Cup semi-final at the Hillsborough ground in Sheffield. Hundreds more were injured. The trouble began just 6 minutes into the FA Cup semi-final at Hillsborough between Nottingham Forest and Liverpool. It appears that hundreds of Liverpool fans without tickets got into the ground through a broken gate. Sheffield hospitals, who were placed on full emergency alert, say they were saturated with the injured.
What should have been one of football's annual showpieces, the FA Cup semi-final, was only 6 minutes old when the problems began. It's understood an outside gate at the Leppings Lane end of the ground had broken, enabling non-ticket holders to flood in. There simply wasn't enough room for them. In the crush, hundreds of supporters were forced onto the pitch, or pulled to safety by fans in the seats above. Many Nottingham Forest fans in a stand at the other end of the field appeared unaware of the severity of the situation. Some continued to chant for their team, which incensed some of the Liverpool supporters involved. Some attempted to charge their rivals, and police formed a barrier across the pitch to keep the fans apart. Emergency services from the Sheffield area were brought in. A total of 20 ambulances were dispatched. Fans ripped down advertising hoardings to use as stretchers. The Liverpool manager Kenny Dalglish and his opposite number Brian Clough were clearly appalled by the scenes. The game was eventually abandoned more than an hour after the problems began. There's so far nothing to suggest that what happened was the result of violence amongst fans. Many of them are blaming the authorities at Hillsborough for letting many supporters into that stand without a ticket.
There's an emergency number in Sheffield for inquiries about the casualties. It's Sheffield, the code is 0742 570 800. That's 0742 570 800. And we'll be repeating that number at the end of this bulletin. What he thought had caused the disaster.
There are two versions of what went wrong. The first is that a door or doors was forced down. The second is that a door or doors was or were opened by someone in authority. It seems clear that more people came into that end than should have been in that end. Obviously there are a lot of casualties. It is reported to me that there are fatalities. If that is the case, it's a desperate situation.
Other news say 74 people died in a crush of spectators at the Hillsborough ground in Sheffield. The emergency number for inquiries is Sheffield, that's 0742 570 800. 0742 570 800. And that's it for now. There'll be further reports on the Hillsborough soccer disaster in BBC Two's News View at 7:15. The next scheduled bulletin here on BBC One is at 9:05.
At the Lepping Road end had begun to spill onto the pitch. At first, the seriousness of the interruption wasn't clear. But as more and more fans crowded onto the playing area, realization that a disaster was unfolding spread swiftly. Many supporters were rushed out of the grounds on stretchers. Other fans stood or lay on the turf, shocked and dazed. Many were in tears. Barricades were used as stretchers. Some fans claimed that the trouble began after non-ticket holders had forced their way through a broken gate, creating massive overcrowding. Others in the crowd said the police had shepherded too many fans into the central terrace at the Liverpool end. Police, firemen and ambulances struggled to reach the injured. A year ago, the same two clubs met in the same ground, with the same number of tickets sold. On that occasion, there was praise for the way the police maintained public order. This was not a battle between fans, but a disaster which evidently arose from the overcrowding, a disaster which so far has cost over 70 lives.
Well, on the line now from Hillsborough is our South Yorkshire correspondent, Mike McCarthy, who can bring us the latest situation. Mike.
Yes, Harry, there's a strange atmosphere of calm here now after the desperation of it all. The odd ambulance is still ferrying people away, and most of the fans have now drifted away. A lot, though, are still wandering about the ground, crying, dazed and shocked, and many of them are very angry. About half an hour ago, the Nottingham Forest manager, Brian Clough, wandered onto the pitch to see what was happening, and the scene at that point was still one of devastation. He was led away after a few minutes. Police have put out an appeal for any social workers, doctors or first aid personnel in the area to come to the ground. That was about half an hour ago, although I believe that they're still asking for social workers to go to Hamerton Road police station to help with bereaved relatives.
Mike, is there any indication of why this started? Because last year, of course, these two sides did meet and the police organised a very, very well-organised semi-final. Any indication there as to what went wrong this time?
Well, as you say, in the past, the police have operated a very, very tight operation at the Hillsborough ground. The trouble occurred at the Leppings Lane end, where the Liverpool fans had been directed to. There was apparently something of a crush outside the ground at the gates of the Leppings Lane end, and from there are two distinct versions of what happened next. The first version is that because of the crush, the gate was just open to let in the fans, to save them being crushed at the gates. The other version is that the gate was forced down. Now, I've been inside the ground speaking to some of the fans, and I've spoken to many fans with full tickets, i.e. The stubs haven't been torn off. They obviously got through without those tickets being checked.
Any indication quickly, Mike, as to how the hospitals are coping? Because clearly they're under a great deal of pressure at the moment.
Routes have been cleared to both major hospitals in the city, the Royal Hallamshire Hospital and the Northern General Hospital. The latest fatality figures are between 70 and 80. But as I'm sure you'll understand, the situation is still confused and that figure could alter. There's a press conference being held now at the ground, and the club is telling reporters exactly what they know about what happened. The FA Secretary, Graham McCrell, has just spoken to reporters here. He says that there'll be a full and searching inquiry into what happened.
Mike McCarthy, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Information is still, of course, sketchy as to the exact number of people who've lost their lives and been injured, but we'll keep you up to date throughout the evening on BBC One. And the Liverpool manager, Kenny Dalglish, made a personal appeal to the fans for calm within minutes of the incident. We're going to leave you with the emergency number.
Martin Lewis in the newsroom.
90 people have been killed in a crush of spectators at this afternoon's FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest in Sheffield. It is the worst disaster in British sporting history. Ambulance services say most of the dead were young men, but several children were also crushed to death. Police say at least 200 other people were injured. The trouble started after Liverpool fans without tickets rushed through a broken turnstile. The match was abandoned 6 minutes into the game as spectators invaded the pitch to escape the crush on the terraces. There's an emergency number for inquiries about casualties. It's 0742, the code for Sheffield, 570 800. That's 0742 570 800.
Well before the game, South Yorkshire Police knew they had to mount a major operation in crowd control. The same two sides had met at the same ground in last year's semi-final. The police were subsequently praised for the way they controlled it. But as the Liverpool fans crowded around the Lepping Road end at Hillsborough, tempers were clearly under strain. Inside the ground, the trouble developed slowly at first, belying the tragedy that was to follow. Some fans claimed that non-ticket holders had forced their way through a broken gate. Others that the police had tried to pack most of the supporters into the central terraced area. As the police tried to filter some of them onto the pitch, others tried to climb over the barriers. After 6 minutes of playing time, the two semi-final teams were led off the pitch. As supporters poured onto the ground in growing numbers, some of the Liverpool fans complained about the allocation of tickets and that non-ticket holders were being let in.
No ticket! Do an exit!
Hundreds of supporters, young and old, were being pulled out of the crowd and taken for treatment. Many were on stretchers. Some improvised from barricades. Others from advertising hoardings torn from around the ground. Many of the Liverpool fans, released from the crush, swiftly joined in the rescue effort, racing across the pitch to deliver the injured to ambulances.
Listen, people, why? Why didn't the FA give us the big ends? Why? Why didn't he give us the big end? We knew they had more supporters. We knew we had more supporters. Why didn't he give us the big ends? Because they knew we had more supporters. And let supporters suffer like that. Why?
The police spread out across the ground, forming a barrier between the rival fans. Unaware of the seriousness of the trouble at the other end, some Forest fans had begun chanting. Everywhere, fans stood, shocked, dazed and in tears, incredulous that once again, Liverpool fans were at the centre of a football tragedy.
The scale of the tragedy has brought swift reaction. The Queen has said she was shocked and saddened. She offered her deepest sympathies to the bereaved and to the injured. Mrs. Thatcher said she shared everyone's disbelief as the mounting horror unfolded on television. She's called for an urgent report. And Sports Minister Colin Moynihan said it was a tragic day for British sport. And to repeat, there is an emergency telephone number for relatives. It's a Sheffield number. The code is 0742 570 800. That's 0742 570 800. And tonight's main news on BBC One will be slightly later than advertised. We'll be bringing you all the latest information on the soccer disaster in an extended programme starting at about 9:10. Tragedy at the Hillsborough football ground in Sheffield. The official death toll is now put at 93, with at least 200 injured. The tragedy unfolded 6 minutes into the FA Cup final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. Most of the fans who were crushed were Liverpool supporters. At a press conference, the Chief Constable, Mr. Wright, admitted that gates were open to let fans in on police instructions.
The gate was opened at police direction. I am not aware of any connection between the opening of the gate and the surge on the terrace.
Why was the gate open to you?
Because there was danger to life outside with crushing.
Is that outside the turnstiles?
Outside the turnstiles at Lepping Lane.
So outside the turnstiles?
Yes.
How did that not start outside the ground? How did it get that bad?
By late arrival of large numbers of people.
Was there no way the police could have shepherded that at all?
Well, that's a question I couldn't answer at this stage.
Is it true that many of the dead, around 40, were actually found in the alleyway from that open gate?
I've no idea.
Do you know not of the positions of the dead?
No, I don't.
Was
at the time the fans arrived late, would the majority of your officers have been inside the ground and maintaining control?
No, they're outside at Leppings Lane. There were 15 mounted officers, at least 15 mounted officers, and at least 40 officers, 40 uniformed officers.
Peter Wright, the Chief Constable of South Yorkshire, speaking about the football tragedy at Hillsborough, in which, just to repeat, the official death toll is now put at 93, with more than 200 injured. It's Britain's worst football tragedy. There's an emergency number to ring if you're worried about relatives. It's 0742 570 800. I'll say that again, 0742 570 800. The news at 9 o'clock will be a joint production between Yorkshire Television and ITN to bring you all the details we have of Britain's worst football tragedy. Good evening.
The news from ITN.
93 people die and hundreds injured in Britain's worst ever sporting disaster. Good evening. 93 soccer fans, mostly teenagers and children, have been crushed to death at today's FA Cup semi-final match between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest, held at Hillsborough in Sheffield. About 200 more were injured. It happened when Liverpool fans without tickets poured into terraces packed with genuine ticket holders at the Liverpool end of the ground. Tonight, the police said they'd opened the gates to prevent crowd problems outside the ground. Hundreds of people tried desperately to escape the overcrowding by scrambling over fences onto the pitch. Many died crushed against the barriers. The Queen has sent a message of sympathy to the bereaved and injured. Mrs. Thatcher says she watched the disaster unfold on television with mounting horror and disbelief. There are two emergency numbers, 0742 570 800, that's 0742 570 800, and 051 708 7277, 051 708 7277.
The first signs of trouble at Hillsborough came 6 minutes after the 3 o'clock kick-off. At the Leppings Lane end of the ground, allocated to Liverpool supporters, the shouts of crushed fans alerted police to what seemed initially like an unpleasant but straightforward overcrowding problem. At first, the game continued, the players oblivious of the impending tragedy on the terracing. But as increasing numbers of fans either collapsed at the pitch side or were carried out by police, it became clear that this was no ordinary crowd problem. For every one supporter pulled out, there were hundreds trapped on the other side, some screaming at the police to do more for those who couldn't move to help themselves. By now, the match had become an irrelevance. The pitch, a huge overspill area for the dead and the injured. The BBC Match of the Day cameras, which had come to record an FA Cup semi-final, were now witnessing a major tragedy. The scenes were tragically reminiscent of the Heysel Stadium disaster 4 years ago when Liverpool fans were involved in a riot. This time they were the innocent victims. Ambulances moved in behind the goal as fans became stretcher bearers for friends and strangers alike. As fire officers arrived to aid the rescue, police formed a barrier across the halfway line to separate rival fans. There was no need. Any differences between the two sets of supporters were forgotten in the face of the tragedy. The Liverpool manager, Kenny Dalglish, could only watch as he had as a player at Heysel. A grief-stricken fan didn't even recognise him.
They all just moved forward quick and they wouldn't back up, so there was people at the front getting crushed and basically screaming because they couldn't breathe. And then they were screaming to the stewards and the police to open the gates, and they were just looking and walking past. They just took a bit too long.
Whereabouts were you at the time?
Just behind the goal, on the terrace.
So what did you actually see as they were spilling over?
Well, people were just crushing, and there was a lad and his girlfriend, and they were just screaming. There's words where, "Please, God, help me." And I believe the girl died. Her face was just blue.
I seen people dead there. I was there, and I was against the bar right at the front. And when I was at the bar at the front, there was people. There was a gentleman on my arm, and he said, "You're choking me, you're choking me," and he just fell. Yeah. He just literally fell, and that was the last of him. It was. Do
you think you're quite sort of lucky to get out?
It must have been my lucky day today. Up there, someone's shining on me, but not them, unfortunately.
Many Forest fans hadn't realised how bad the trouble initially was.
Not at first, but after that, obviously who I was with, he had a pain in his chest from an operation he'd had anyway, so we had to take him out. And then the Forest fans were helping the police and the first aid people with the stretchers to get them into the ground. At first we didn't realise how bad it was. But the more people that came on, they could see how bad it was. Everybody was crying, people were being ill, it was awful. I was sitting in the ambulance with my friend and 4 people were brought outside, they were dead on stretchers. It was just sickening. People were screaming, then starting aggravated with the police because they wanted them to get moving quicker. It was awful, absolutely awful.
The horror of the afternoon was captured by dozens of photographers there to cover the match for the Sunday papers. .20 is final whistle time on a normal Saturday afternoon. By that time, Hillsborough was peaceful and relatively empty, just as it would be in the aftermath of any big game. Today, though, there was no talk of football here. Instead, the estimates of the dozens crushed and suffocated to death and the dozens more injured were slowly mounting. And the questions were just beginning. Questions about how the second tragedy to afflict Liverpool Football Club and the worst in British soccer history could have been allowed to happen.
Shock and disbelief were etched on the faces of even those hardened to human tragedy. Policemen and women had tried desperately to pull the victims clear. The sheer weight of people made it a virtually impossible task. Even after the crowd had dispersed, some supporters remained at the scene, too upset to leave. It was here that many of the victims died, crushed against barriers that gave way like matchsticks. Designed to withstand a normal crowd surge, they provided little protection against the overwhelming number of extra fans who poured into the enclosure. There was no escape onto the pitch for those at the front, many of them young children getting a good view of the match. They paid the price of past invasions of the playing field, which forced the football authorities to recommend fencing around league grounds. They were finally freed when wire cutters were used to cut holes in the fence. In a game where many of the voices heard are usually discordant ones, the two clubs were united in calling for a full inquiry into what happened.
No one in that crowd today thought that there would be anything except a magnificent game of football. The atmosphere at the beginning of the game was magnificent, and for the first 6 minutes, I think everyone was anticipating a magnificent 90 minutes. And I am absolutely horrified and disgusted what has happened. But we now must await the outcome of a very, very searching inquiry.
I'm sure a lot of people will feel that there's just nothing left. There are people that came today full of hopes and aspirations. You know, they're in a mortuary at the moment.
There has got to be a very large question mark over whether we can take matches of this nature to neutral grounds like a club ground in future. It may be that we will have to examine the possibility of going to Wembley, which has a capacity of 75 or 80,000 or even more than that. We've got to examine all the options, but I think that's a considerable way down the line. My thoughts at the moment are for the people who've been injured and or bereaved.
A Liverpool fan paid his own simple tribute to the dead, laying flowers in the goalmouth where hours earlier 2 teams had competed for something which then seemed of huge importance. As more wreaths began arriving at the scene, the soccer world was once again plunged into mourning. The game that usually occupies the back pages is now thrust into the limelight once again for all the wrong reasons. Those inside the game admit it will take a long time to recover from this latest tragedy, even after a full-scale inquiry has been held. Today, though, there was only time to mourn the dead.
Again and again, the ambulances arrived at 3 hospitals, 2 in Sheffield, 1 in Barnsley.
the injured fans suffering mainly from crushing and suffocation. Some needed only minor treatment. Some were beyond any. All available staff arrived as carefully planned disaster routines went into action as no one hoped they would.
Patients who've been admitted have all been admitted because of crush injuries, suffocation, essentially, and are either being cared for in one of our general wards or in one of our intensive care units.
How do you think the hospital has coped so far?
Hospital has coped absolutely superbly. I'm very, very proud indeed of the hospital and all of the staff within it. The local community has responded very well indeed. We've had a lot of calls of help and support from voluntary organisations and ordinary men and women in the street, and people have really responded very well.
Back at the ground, the streets were jammed with every available ambulance. Firemen with no fire to put out pressed into service as stretcher bearers, while the stunned supporters stood around. Many followed the ambulances to hospital, the only way to find out if their friends were all right. Back at the Northern General, more supplies were arriving all the time. Extra sheets, blankets, trolley beds, stands for intravenous drips, surgical supplies. And all the time, the medical staff to use them. By now, the doctors were getting a clearer picture of the injuries and how to deal with the more serious ones.
Most of these patients are on ventilators, therefore they will be receiving drugs to keep them unconscious. And the plan will probably be to ventilate these patients overnight.
And the ones that aren't in intensive care, what sort of general condition are they in?
Most of them have injuries of varying severity. One patient has gone to theatre for emergency surgery. I believe he's doing fairly well. Of the others, many are still undergoing investigation, but I don't think anyone requires immediate surgery at the moment.
They would be crush injuries, would they?
They are almost all crush injuries, yes.
Now, at least, they know the scale of what they have to cope with in the days ahead. In the short term, no one at these hospitals is expecting much sleep tonight.
And let me repeat those two emergency numbers. The first one is 0742 570 800. That's 0742 570 800. And the second is a Liverpool number, 051 708 7277. That's 051 708 7277. A few moments ago, two Liverpool fans who were at the match came into ITN. They made it clear there'd been no trouble amongst the fans.
And there was police, 3 or 4 policemen standing around the gate. I don't know if there was who was in charge, and they were opened by them rather than being. It could not have been pushed down for the simple reason that it's the sliding doors rather than a gates.
There was no possibility of the fans pushing their own way through.
No possibility whatsoever. And it was just bedlam. You know, people were getting crushed. There was girls crying. There was one lad who was near enough fainting, and people were talking to him, trying to stop him from kind of whatever. You don't know what's going to go on there. And we got pushed up against the barrier. Well, I must admit, I was probably a couple of minutes from death because I was crushed up against the barrier. It was only my brother Martin who stopped me from getting crushed.
Everyone was screaming at this policeman to open this gate, the one solitary gate at the front. Open, open, open it. He opened it and pushed these lads back in the ground. And there was about 3 or 4, 5 lads who had jumped over to escape. They opened this gate and put them back in, you know, like, why, you know, I mean, it's just like pushing them back into the already crowded. Then they closed the gate. 5 minutes later, that's when they opened the gate and things started, you know, easing. But
well, South Yorkshire's Chief Constable Peter Wright said the opening of the perimeter gates to allow fans to enter the ground coincided with the crash inside, but he refused to say whether the two events were linked.
Ever since the ground was upgraded for the 1966 World Cup, Hillsborough has been an established venue for FA Cup semi-finals. But this year there was controversy weeks before the game when Liverpool complained they were allocated 3,000 fewer tickets than Forest. And the club was given the much smaller Leppings Lane end of the ground because it was nearer to approach roads from Liverpool. That may prove to be the key to what went wrong, rather than the design and condition of the ground itself, which experts say are good.
I think there is absolutely nothing wrong with the safety element of the ground itself. It's tested every year under the Safety of Sports Ground Act, and the South Yorkshire Police are very well equipped to monitor and test the standards at the ground.
So in the past it's had a good record of crowd control?
Yes, there has been no major incidents at the ground in the last 20, 30 years.
Hillsborough's excellent safety record ended 6 minutes into the game. A 15-foot steel exit gate at the back of the stand was opened by a police officer. 2,000 supporters surged through into the already packed terracing, divided into 4 by 7-foot-high steel fences. Thousands were crushed against the high barriers built for crowd safety. Fans who escaped were quick to apportion blame.
I would blame the police for opening the doors.
The fault was we weren't given the right end of the ground.
That's the big fault.
Too small a space.
Too small, too many people in it.
Police tonight defended their actions before and during the disaster.
Well, my information is that about 5 minutes after kick-off, there was a surge on the Leppings Lane stand. And as a result of that surge, people were trapped. And fatalities were caused and a great number of injuries, 93 fatalities as I understand it, and over 200 people who were injured, many of whom are still detained. I do not know what caused the surge.
Fans at the ground, all of them say the surge was caused because the police opened a main gate at the Leppings Lane end to let people in because of a crash outside the ground, and that led to the surge inside the ground.
I'm not sure how fans would be aware of that. If you were inside the ground, you wouldn't really know what was happening outside. It is true that there was a situation developed outside the ground where about 3,000 to 4,000 people were crushed against the turnstile entrances of Leppings Lane. And the officer in charge of that section decided to relieve the pressure because he was concerned about fatalities and injury. And he led that some were allowed to go under a fence and through a gate. As I understand it, and I can only tell you what I know third and fourth hand, it was a concertina-type gate. It wasn't, the entry wasn't so great as to allow a flood of people that surged onto the terrace. I'm unaware of any connection between the opening of the gate and the surge on the stands, but clearly the whole nature of the events of that quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, will be the subject of an in-depth examination.
That inquiry will inevitably look at why the gates were opened, why the bigger club were allocated the smaller terracing, and why so many fans were unable to escape the crush.
First of all, we've got to look very seriously into the ticket allocation. Secondly, the policing outside the ground, what went wrong there to cause the build-up. And thirdly, I would like to see the removal of the perimeter fences which prevented people escaping from the crushed terrace out onto the pitch. I think the death toll would have been much smaller had there been no fences there.
The Bradford fire tragedy led to the Popplewell inquiry, which recommended major safety improvements at every league ground. This, the worst disaster in British soccer, will be the focus of another inquiry when perhaps more lessons can be learned.
Church and political leaders have tonight been expressing their sympathy for the bereaved and injured. Labour's Neil Kinnock said the causes must be discovered and the lessons learned as quickly as possible. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Robert Runcie, said, "My heart goes out to the victims and their families." Cardinal Basil Hume said he was stunned and saddened by the enormity of the tragedy. And Colin Harvey, manager of Everton, who beat Norwich today to reach the FA Cup final, said his team's dressing room was very quiet considering we'd just got to Wembley. The local MP, David Blunkett, had this reaction.
It's a terrible tragedy on top of what's happened elsewhere over the last 6 months. And obviously the inquiry is going to have to establish exactly what did happen. Were gates opened? Did lunatics climb over the wall? What could have been done to prevent this tragedy in a ground which has been renowned for safety and common sense over many years?
Obviously, the police will hold an inquiry and there'll be an inquest. Do you think there is a need for a public inquiry into this?
I think there will have to be. I think on Monday in the House of Commons we'll expect a statement to that effect. And although politicians are renowned for saying things that have total irrelevance to a situation like this, I think on this occasion we'll want to know not just what happened, but how we ensure that it never happens again.
1971, when 66 fans died at Ibrox Park in Glasgow in a crowd crash. May 1985 saw 3 tragedies at football grounds. 56 died in the Bradford fire. A few days later, 39 were killed at the Heysel Stadium in Brussels when fighting broke out between Liverpool and Juventus fans, and 10 were killed at the Olympic Stadium in Mexico City in crowd panic. Survivors of the disaster have been arriving home in Liverpool tonight. Some are still unsure of the fate of their friends.
Tonight, Merseyside is in a state of shock. Returning Everton fans, victorious after their team's semi-final, realised the full scale of the tragedy when they got back into Liverpool's Lime Street station.
It's almost like the Heysel thing all over again. You know, it's just a downer, really.
20 people are dead, and it went up
went up to 70.
Yeah, we've all got friends there who went there.
Next day, you're thinking about your mates, you know.
For many thousands of Merseysiders anxious for news, it's been a long night waiting for their loved ones to return from Sheffield.
We were all piling in one part, and other part was empty, and he just piled in one section. And he should have been stopped. The police should have told him to go to the next section, and he didn't, and they just squashed him over.
Already an appeal fund has been set up, and the Red Cross are taking families across the Pennines to see the fans injured in the disaster. Tomorrow, Liverpool's Catholic Archbishop will also make the trip to visit the survivors.
Overwhelming sorrow. It's heightened by a number of facts. I think the whole city was incredulous when the news began to break. When one saw those pictures on television, I thought for a moment that they were showing once more the tragedy at Hillsborough.
Liverpool's Catholic Cathedral tomorrow night.
The scene in Liverpool tonight.